This afternoon we're lucky enough to have two very well-informed academics who have focused on Venezuela for years. I think if you add it up cumulatively, we're talking several decades of Venezuela expertise. To my left, literally, is David Smilde, Senior Fellow at WOLA, and the Charles A. Leo M. Favreau Professor of Human Relations at Tulane University. And to my right, again, only literally now, Michael McCarthy, Research Fellow, Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University. As I said, I think the title to today's event says a lot. The combination of deepening economic crisis and political turmoil and a looming election season combining to make the first couple of months in Venezuela shaping up as months of turmoil. So I think we're very lucky to have the insights of both of our speakers today. Our format will be David will speak first for about 20 to 25 minutes, followed immediately by Michael, and then we'll open to questions. And I'll reiterate then when we open to questions, you'll need to speak loudly, say who you are, and depending on how many hands we see, we'll take a round and come back as many times as we can to our speakers. So without further ado, and I also want to welcome anyone who's watching via webcast.
Okay. Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming out today. It's always great to be here at WOLA and here in DC and have an audience that really cares about these issues. There's so much to say about this that we're going to be double teaming today and trying to cover the most important issues, but we're really going to make an emphasis to try and leave a good 45 minutes or so for Q&A, because I think that's really the most interesting part. I'm going to start by looking basically at Chavismo, at the government and sort of the strategic situation it's in, and sort of moving forward, things to look at and think about the likely future, 2015. Now, of course, the situation in Maduro right now is dominated by a very acute economic situation. You know? It's important to realize that this situation is not properly understood as resulting from a decline in oil prices. This situation actually existed before the decline in oil prices. In fact, in June 2013, a couple months after Maduro was elected, we were talking about, I was doing television interviews, and we were writing on the blog about the nature of scarcities and what was actually going on. At that time, Maduro had 50% approval ratings, and oil was at $100 a barrel. Now, all of those economic problems have continued and have actually gotten worse, you know, because of lack of reform, and all of the problems are getting worse, and because of the lack of reform, because of postponing reform. And now Maduro is facing serious decline in oil revenue, something that's really only starting to show. The worst is yet to come. And he has popularity in the 20s. You know? So the situation is worse. It's going to get worse, and he has a little less political capital to actually deal with it. So it's a very serious situation. I'm going to look at these different elements in the rest of my comments. First, the economic situation. Now, it's important to understand what we're talking about when we talk about inflation and scarcities. There's a lot of misunderstanding, and I can just imagine how Twitter sphere is going to light up when I start talking about this, because people get very irritated with what I have to say. And that is that scarcities do not equal hunger. You know? You're not talking about hunger when you're talking about scarcities. You're talking about the difficulties of getting what you want when you want. Now, this is actually not that hard to see if you look at the statistics. If you really, Venezuela has been suffering scarcity since 2007, 2008. If you look at the data from 2007 to 2012, at the same time that Venezuela has consistently suffered scarcities of 20% or so, and that means that in any given market or in any given supermarket, 20% of the basic basket of goods are not available. At the same time that they had these scarcities, consumption has soared. Consumption has gone up. You know, calorie intake, protein intake, all kinds of indicators. Every indicator you can imagine, consumption has gone up. Now, of course, this actually makes sense. You know, if you think about it, step back. If you consume more, well, then there's less to go around. It's very likely there's going to be scarcities. You know? And politically, this did not hurt the government that much through 2012, I think, because it's something that has a strong, the experience of scarcities is strongly class dependent. You know? So it really affects, traditionally it really affects the middle class more than the lower classes, because middle class, people like almost everybody in this room, is used to doing one-stop shopping, or shopping once every other week, you know, and getting everything you need and go home. People that are poor and have worked with less cash flow tend to do more shopping. Sometimes shop every single day for what they need. And so the idea that you have to go and continue to look for goods, you know, is something that disrupts middle class routines more than lower class routines. And if you add to that this is accompanied by the fact that lower class can oftentimes access goods that they previously couldn't. Meat, chicken, you know, high quality goods that sometimes might have been quite difficult. The government did not really pay a price for this, for scarcities. It was just part of the model. Now I think this is something that's still evolving, that we're still trying to understand. But I think this is changing. 2013, 2014, I think this structure of scarcities is changing, especially in the past 6 months. And what has happened now is that inflation has gotten to the point that people in the popular sectors, the poorer sectors, poorer classes of Venezuela, now are very dependent on price-controlled goods, rice, milk, chicken, all the things that you get in state stores or the price-controlled, and those are the hardest goods to get. You know? So the scarcities have gotten to the point that they're really, at this point, affecting the lower classes more than the middle classes, who now have been, for a couple of years, have had this problem already. You know, because middle classes, you can get a lot of goods, but oftentimes you have to get them from street sellers, get them in the informal economy with prices that are 3, 4, 5, 10 times as high as the control prices. And so middle class is more able to do that. Lower classes are much more dependent, and now there's people that basically have to spend hours every day, you know, in lines to try and get these goods. I think that's what accounts for the real decline in Maduro's popularity. You know, this is the scarcity. If you look at some of the polling, Data Analysis does some really interesting polling in which they look at variables and what variables do the most positive or negative impact for different leaders. And the thing that most impact Maduro right now are scarcities. You know, this is what and scarcity. I think it's really scarcity inflation complex. So it still doesn't mean hunger. You know, and Twitter sphere can go wild over that if they want, but it still doesn't mean hunger. It doesn't mean that there's widespread hunger. What it does mean is that there's widespread discontent at the amount of time people have to spend in lines, at the amount of, you know, at the sheer difficulty of getting. I mean, people with small children that can't get diapers, you know, adult diapers, people, you know, that can't get milk. I mean, there's some really difficult, very tragic circumstances that are affecting citizens in general, and especially people of popular classes. The thinking about the government. You know, okay, so this is where we are. Right now, in 2015, oil is at $40 to $50 a barrel, whereas a year ago it was at $100 a barrel. So obviously about half, the government's going to have about half as much revenue as it had last year. Of course, it can get some loans, but it really needs to seek adjustments. It's important to realize that the problem that Venezuela is confronting is really a problem of its own creation. You know? It's really not even a problem of the model, you know, of all these state subsidies, of all these state social programs. It's really a problem of dramatic economic distortions. So, for example, Francisco Rodriguez, who's the lead economist at Merrill Lynch for the Andean region, came up with a really quite interesting analysis, and he looks at, basically just says, well, the biggest problem with this government is the amount of money that it gives away. You know, if you think that it sells most of its dollars, about 70% of its dollars that come in for oil, it sells at 6.3, roughly 5% of what that dollar is actually worth. It's giving away 95% of those dollars. So it's basically giving away, and people, you know, some of that contributes to maintaining prices low, but a lot of that gets skimmed off. There's huge corruption schemes. If you add that together, and gas that's pennies per liter, in addition to electricity, which has not been adjusted in about 5 years, he calculates that the government gives away about $50 billion a year. You know? If they didn't give that money away, even at $40 a barrel, they would have no problem paying their bills. You know, and they could probably even keep up their expenditures. It's really a problem of dramatic economic distortions, more than the model. And of course, the oil decline is going to make it that much more difficult to carry out this adjustment. Another element of Maduro's situation is that it's very difficult for him to make changes. You know, this is a classic problem of charismatic succession. You know, Maduro was designated by Chavez. You know, Chavez was an incredibly charismatic leader. He designated Maduro to be his successor. Really, what Maduro had going for him was only that, just Chavez's designation of him. So he doesn't have the room to just change the model like, say, Bloomberg did after Giuliani or Santos did after Álvaro Uribe. He can't just say, oh, we're going a different way now. Because people are going to say, you know, you're not following Chavez's legacy. You know, you're not continuing what you're supposed to be doing. So he has basically just continued Chavez's model from 2013 right to the present. He's modified very little, and I think really, you know, that's the problem. Maduro inherited extensive economic problems, you know, and that's not his fault. What is his fault is the fact that he has not found a way to actually push forward with significant reform. Within the Chavista coalition, anti-neoliberalism is a key ideological tenet. You know? So it's very difficult to just suddenly come up with the logic, oh, we need to float the exchange rate so that, you know, we can have more export-oriented business. It's just very difficult for him to say that. If you think back to Chavismo, you know, Chavismo, you know, the Bolivarian movement identified the February 27 riots as the moment that they really decided they had to act. Of course, those were riots against the structural adjustment package of Carlos Andrés Pérez. And so at the very core is sort of an anti-neoliberalism. It really makes it difficult for Maduro to adjust. In addition is the problem of state capture. You know, there's so much money running through this government. It's an oil-funded government. It's a petroleum state, and it has this dramatic distortion going on with the exchange rate. And of course, when you have that, you have people that immediately take advantage of it. And once people start taking advantage of it, making big money and developing big networks of political power around this, they're going to conserve that situation. They become stakeholders and they become a conservative force. And so this is what political scientists call state capture. You know, there's that going on as well that I think really makes it difficult to reform. Okay, so in terms of Maduro's popularity, Maduro has sunk to depths not previously seen in Chavismo. So it's important. You know, data analysis, data analysis polling in December showed that Maduro's popularity had dropped to 22%. You know, the January polling showed it was at 23%. this is really low for Chavismo. The scarcities affect him quite significantly, and it's important to understand that this was true of Chavez as well. Chavez's popularity, the variable that most highly correlated with Chavez's popularity during his presidency was monetary liquidity, which at that time was closely associated with economic growth. It's not anymore. But so he was a president. Economics is part of it, and it's not just an instrumentalist relationship. It's because Chavismo has always had this ideology that neoliberalism was because of this corrupt elite and imperialism. If we get control of our oil, you can live well. And so and Chavez largely delivered on that for most people in the view of most people and in their experience. Okay, so let's think about what's going on, what the possible paths forward are. Basically, I think what is happening in Venezuela is Maduro is basically taking Chavismo, has taken an unsustainable model and is basically driving it to its reductio ad absurdum, driving it into the ground. And so the question is, what can happen? There's going to be change. Something has got to be changed. Basically, I think the three possibilities are to reform the economy in time that there can be a recovery that can recover Maduro's popularity, or the government can be voted out. Because we have legislative elections this year, and next year a recall referendum is available, and so the government can be voted out, or it could become a significantly less democratic movement. And there's an assumption there that some people disagree with. I think of Chavismo, one of the most important characteristics of Chavismo is the fact that it is a government, is a socialist government, a socialist-inspired government that has consistently been supported with the polls. It's an electoral movement, and that could conceivably be in jeopardy. So let's take a look at some of these possibilities. In terms of reform and turn it around, it's interesting to note that Maduro in the opposition, if you look at the numbers, they're roughly where Chavez was in 2004 at this time. In February or so of 2004. Chavez was around 30%, opposition was up to 45%. They were far ahead of Chavismo. Nevertheless, by the recall referendum, which was held on August 15, 2004, Chavismo won it by a landslide. So I think, in terms of popularity, Maduro is in dire straits. I think, however, these polling numbers are rather superficial in the sense that I don't really see that there's a really hard rejection of Chavismo and opposition. Of Chavismo and the president. I think they could turn it around. On the other hand, opposition is up. They're around 40% now. I think that's about the peak that they're going to get with their current strategy, which is basically no strategy. I think they're really going to have to come forward with a message and a campaign if they want to get up to 45–50%. And so I don't think that the results of an election are at all predetermined in Venezuela. I must say, I wouldn't want to be in Maduro's position. I think they have a tough road to hoe, but it's certainly not inconceivable that they could do quite well in the elections. As far as actually pushing forward with reform that could turn around the economic situation, the government in the past month has actually taken on some reforms. They have floated the Bolivar, and they basically reestablished what's called the permuta market, a market that actually works through bonds, but you can freely exchange Bolivars. And they've actually let it flow. They've exchanged it at 172, 175. They've actually let it flow. That's a very good sign. The bad thing is that they also kept the 6.3 rate for priority goods, things like food and medicines, and that having these such huge difference in exchange rates is just ripe for corruption. So I really think and they've also talked about they're putting forward some public service messages to talk about raising gas prices. And that's that's good. That's admirable that they're actually going forward with that. I tend to think that what they're doing is really too little, too late. I think for them to actually push forward reform and see some results and turn around the economy, it would have to be something much more dramatic than this and much more, much quicker than what's going on. So the third possibility is of Chavismo becoming a much less democratic government. I think, and we are seeing this. So of course we're seeing all these things at the same time. The government is trying to push forward with some reforms, economic reforms that can put it in a better position. But I think it's also, pushing forward in a more authoritarian, more ominous, and worrying direction. I mean, already from, the conditions this year are much worse than they were a year ago. Yet there's much less protest, and I think a lot of that is because of the progressive criminalization of protest that really started even before Maduro, but was really accentuated in 2014. Around 3,500 people were arrested in 2014. About 2,000 of them still have judicial processes that they're undergoing, which limits their freedom and limits what they can do, because if they get caught protesting again, it can really complicate their situation. And 60 of them are still detained. Of course, there's also the excessive use of force. In 2014, use of tear gas, use of plastic bullets, the use of live fire was by police forces and the National Guard. Made international news, and undoubtedly it was excessive. In addition to this, in 2014 we saw sort of what appeared to be the coordinated cooperation of armed civilian groups, which got to be known as colectivos. I think not many of them were colectivos. I think they were had other sources. But undeniable, there's a very important, significant situation in which there are armed civilians that were firing out in opposition protests. And all of these things make it much less likely for people to protest today. And it's just people that would have protested a year ago or 2 years ago think about it twice and are just not willing to go out. If you add to this a resolution that was passed in January called Resolution 8610, this is a resolution that I think is very pernicious, but not for the reasons that most people say. I think most people really miss the point about this resolution. What you see continually in the media is that this resolution, the most important point is that it allows security forces to fire on protesters. That's not actually true. That's not correct. What it actually does is it provides for the progressive use of force in protests. And it does so in terms that I think are actually quite progressive and consistent with international legislation. You can't just fire on peaceful protesters. You could fire on people that started protesting or fire on you. But so it comes up with all these different steps of force that can be used in different conditions. And so that is actually a progressive element of this legislation that I think has been misrepresented. Nevertheless, what it does is it allows the armed forces, the other branches of the armed forces, to participate in policing of protests. And that is very worrying. In fact, the progressive elements of this resolution already existed in exactly the same terms for the National Police. And if you look at the records, most of the human rights violations in 2014 were by the National Guard. The National Police performed relatively better. And so the idea was to take that legislation, put it on the National Guard. But they could have done that very easily by just adding a clause to that existing legislation, saying this goes for National Guard as well. Instead, what they did, they brought this in a new bill that just talks about the armed forces, and so it implicitly allows not just the National Guard, who are constitutionally supposed to be the ones who alleviate police when they can't handle it, but it allows the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, the Navy, whoever is in the armed forces. And I think that's very pernicious. I think that's really unfortunate. You know, there's been a lot of criticism by human rights groups. Even the ombudsman, Venezuela's ombudsman, said that that needs to be changed. We'll see if it actually does change it. You know, I think it's not just by chance that they wrote up this whole new legislation. I think the government is very concerned about civil unrest in the future, and sees perhaps the necessity of bringing in the armed forces. And I think that should really be avoided, and hopefully will be turned back. Of course, this week making news, or last week making news, was the jailing of Antonio Ledesma. You know, I think this is we still don't know all the details. The government says that he was involved in a coup. They say they have evidence on this. You know, so far the evidence that they've trotted out in most of these cases has not been impressive. And I just have to assume that this is what's going to happen this time as well. Of course, if someone's involved in a coup, the government has the right to detain that person. But here, this is an elected leader, is a leader of the opposition, and you know, I think it's incumbent on the government to provide very clear and transparent evidence of what is going on. Otherwise, this is a real violation of rule and law. Kind of running out of time here, so let me just jump up ahead a little bit and talk about. We have this situation. The government is in a very difficult situation. They're trying to do something about it. It looks inadequate. And there's also a sort of authoritarian direction being taken. So the question is, what glimmers of hope are there? Where can we see something that could prevent this from getting out of hand? I think, you know, domestically, you know, the judicial system, I have a piece that's out on the table there that, you know, I think is very negative. I try really hard to say good things about, say something good about whatever I write about, but I couldn't find anything good to say about the judicial system when I examined it. It was so completely co-opted that, you know, it's a really difficult situation. If you look at other elements of the government, one, I wouldn't say necessarily a bright spot, but one point of continuity and one situation that has not deteriorated is the National Electoral Council. You know, there was a renewal of the electoral authorities at the end of 2014. That was a situation that provided a lot of hope, as well as a lot of hope, as well as a lot of fear. In the end, the CNE looks very similar to what it looked like before, you know? And so it's the same CNE that you know, governed the elections the past, what, 3-4 years, except for one person, except for the opposition. And they actually have a very good opposition person, technically very good and politically quite good. And so the CNE, you know, has shown itself incapable of controlling campaign conditions, you know? In previous elections, there's really a very difficult problem with incumbents' advantage in Venezuela. However, it runs a clean election day, and you know, I'm hoping that stays the same. If that stays the same, I think it's you know, that's something that could really diffuse potential conflict. As well, it's worth mentioning there's a new ombudsman, Tarek William. Is the new ombudsman that human rights groups have embraced. He's met with human rights groups, and you know, so there's some degree of optimism there, although it's clearly not the independence that an ombudsman's office should have. I think the international, you have to give me just a couple more minutes. The international community, I think, you know, new bodies like UNASUR and CELAC have a key role. No, it's important to remember that these organizations, these institutions are actually an alliance of countries. You know, they are at the service of governments, really, not citizens, and so that definitely reduces their potential in serving as mediation. Nevertheless, UNASUR is the one body that Venezuela actually listens to. You know, 2014. Venezuela wanted a letter of support from UNASUR. What they actually got was a visit from the foreign ministers. They wanted a visit and the rubber stamp. What they actually got was a dialogue. You know, not things that they actually sought, but they actually listened. UNASUR is, I think, probably the most important organization. yeah, unfortunately, I think what has sort of really clouded the possibilities that UNASUR and CELAC could have a role is U.S. sanctions. You know, is the pushing forward of U.S. sanctions from December to the present. The you know, of course, any of you who follow our friends at WOLA know that we were strongly against this and fought against it for about 9 months. And you know, we're starting to see just in the past couple of weeks exactly what we feared. You know, that this was going to be used in conspiracy theories and it was going to prevent other regional bodies from really reining in Venezuela. I mean, you know, it's just a prompt for sort of unquestioning solidarity. So just think about the following sequence of events from the past month. You know, January was a quite difficult month for the government. There were scarcities, there were long lines, the optics were terrible. Maduro gave a State of the Union address. It wasn't that well received. No, but basically it was focused on domestic issues. At the end of the month, there was some sort of fraying in some of the regional support. Chile said, well, there should be we should reinitiate dialogue. Venezuela reacted to that very dramatically. Then Colombia said, well, they should release political prisoners, including Leopoldo Lopez, and Maduro reacted to that very strongly. And in fact, at the beginning of the CELAC conference, and at the end of January, the leaders of the conference asked Venezuela and Colombia to keep things civil. So not only did they keep things civil, but by the end of the CELAC conference, Venezuela had gotten a unanimous resolution condemning the sanctions. So not only its allies, but Colombia, Peru, Chile, Mexico, you know, all of these countries that are close to the United States participated in this unanimous resolution. But Maduro came back from CELAC and you know, emboldened and back on message, and he came back with this speech, you know, calling out to Obama, calling out to Obama's conscience to stop harassing Venezuela. The next day, the State Department announces an extension of visa restrictions, you know, part of this different instruments of sanctions. Maduro that afternoon then calls on Samper for UNASUR to lead mediation between Venezuela and the United States. Of course, that sounds kind of crazy, you know, because Venezuela and the United States have diplomatic relations. They can, you know, Venezuela could just drive down, I don't know what street that is, to the State Department. They could have a conversation anytime they want. And furthermore, the United States is not part of UNASUR. And so it just seemed like a crazy request, you know. But what happened? Samper embraced it and said, we are going to bring this to UNASUR. And then they had this conference in Uruguay that brought together the foreign ministers of Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador, Samper, and I think maybe Colombia was there as well, to talk about this. And the whole thing ended up with, you know, UNASUR is very concerned about relations to Venezuela and the United States, and they're going to do the best they can to move forward dialogue. Dialogue is good, but it pushed forward this whole image that this problem is between Venezuela and the United States. You know? And I think that's very, very unconstructive, because the problem, that's not the problem. There might be tensions or problems between Venezuela and the United States, but that's not what's going on with the economy. That's not what's going on with economics either. So I think, you know, now UNASUR is putting together a delegation of foreign ministers, Ecuador, Brazil, and Colombia to work on Venezuela. But let there be no doubt, you know, UNASUR countries don't really want to do something about Venezuela. No, Venezuela is an ally. They don't want to have to come in and try and rein in Venezuela. No, they're adults. They're you know, they have the same situation as anybody else. You know, the United States, for example, has allies like Egypt, Israel, and Saudi Arabia that they don't really want to do anything with either. They're only going to do it if they really have to. If the environment is such that to conserve their reputation, they're going to do something. And so, you know, I think from their perspective, U.S. sanctions are sort of a welcome distraction that are grabbed onto to not do anything about Venezuela. And so I think, you know, if the United States is concerned about what's going on in Venezuela, I really think They should focus on communicating their concern with regional allies, working to United Nations, working, with the Vatican. I really think that there's no useful public role for the United States, which I'm sure is frustrating for people. But I think ignoring that reality and just pushing forward like the United States can fix anything, any problem in the world, I think it just leads to unintended consequences, as it has in so many times in the past. Okay. All right.